is Building Bridges with Mimi Rosenberg and Ken Nash.
Later on, which side are you on? With family members of people killed by police in New York, Madison, Wisconsin, Waukegan, Illinois, Detroit, and with Dr. Cornel West.
Now, there is a commemorative marker at the site where a flood wall protecting the lower ninth wall collapsed, unleashing a wall of water 10 years ago during Hurricane Katrina. The resulting flood wiped out the African-American neighborhood and killed scores of its residents. And now what has been left in its wake is little more than the commemorative marker at the site where the flood wall protecting the neighborhood collapsed.
10 years after Hurricane Katrina made landfall in southeast Louisiana, journalist, author of Katrina After the Flood, Gary Rivlin, retraces the storm's damage, the city of New Orleans' efforts to rebuild itself, and the storm's lasting effects, not just on the city's geography and infrastructure, but on the psychic, racial, and social fabric of that city, highlighting the mass dislocation of the African-American residents of the lower Ninth Ward and why the neighborhood still hasn't been thrown a life preserver.
And we'll continue to ask whether government's benign neglect of the impoverished African-American population has still not been answered for, and indeed whether it continues to sacrifice the poor on the altar of whiter and wealthier developers and development. Gary Rivlin, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, I want to begin with actually a post by the Color of Change, which says, hey, 10 years ago it was the Gulf Coast. Now it's Oakland and Sanford. It's Ferguson and Staten Island. It's Baltimore, Chicago, and Waller County, Texas. And it's still New Orleans. The fight to improve the lives of black folks is happening everywhere. What they are saying is that what happened during Katrina was a systemic failure of government from the White House down to the mayor's office. Can we start with that? Is that your assessment, that that is a primary lesson to take away as we watch the gleeful presence of George W. Bush at one of the charter schools on the 10th anniversary of Katrina?
Right. Yes, it was a systematic failure, and maybe what's worse is we all, the whole world, saw the failures of the Bush administration to rescue folks who were stuck for 5 days. 25,000 people were stuck for 5 days at the Superdome. 20,000 at the Convention Center. They weren't rescued to day 6 or 7. This is a city right along a river. I mean, it shouldn't have been that hard if it had been more of a priority. But what's worse to me is in the rebuilding, the way race and class played this insidious role that helped shape a New Orleans that's very different today than it was at the time of Katrina.
I wonder if you could expand on that, not only in terms of it being a failure, but perhaps what has happened has been a proactive policy on the part of the ruling class to change the composition of the city.
So let's start with public housing. We'll start with low-income African Americans. Some public housing was flooded, but much of it wasn't. But rather than opening it in those first months when the city was desperate for affordable housing, right? I mean, 80% of the city was covered with water, so housing was at a real premium. They never opened. Even those units that were not flooded, they're just all surrounded in fencing and razor wire on top, and never opened. Year 1, year 2, people are desperate. People's stuff was inside, but they never let them inside. And in fact, the big four housing project units in New Orleans, all of them were knocked down. All of them were replaced by mixed income. New Orleans, the city with the oldest public hospital, Cherry Hospital, in the country. It and Bellevue date back to 1736 by coincidence. Moderate damage. FEMA said $100 million we could fix it up. The doctors, the nurses, the other staff there started working on it. But the state before Katrina had wanted to shut it down. And, Naomi Klein, disaster capitalism, this was the moment. Shock doctrine, this was the moment that they could take advantage. New Orleans now has no public hospital. Charity Hospital is just sitting there moldering. It has never opened. It will never open. You just go down the line. Renters, 54% of New Orleans were renters. There was a lot of concern for homeowners in New Orleans, but there was never a plan to help renters back, to have affordable housing for people, because what happens when most of your city is flooded, rents soared. It went up like the first year like 35% rents, and so it became this unaffordable place, especially for the working poor, those who work in the kitchen help, the housekeepers in the big hotels, trying to get by on $15,000, $18,000, $20,000 a year, and suddenly rents are going up by 35%.
Gary, the reason, one of the other reasons I mentioned Bush is the systems of government patted themselves somewhat on the back as they look at the bright, shiny new streets and pavement in the heart of New Orleans, which, of course, many of the long-term residents, African American, have described as kind of Disneyfied, or a really poor caricature of the culture that exists theretofore. But we have Mr. Bush in a charter school, and virtually all of the schooling, if not all of it, is now charterized. And one of the things that hit me is that most of the jobs previously in the school system were African American individuals who were certainly aspiring towards the middle class. Those jobs were completely wiped out, and now you have a privatized, deunionized workforce that is without benefits, without the other protections that unions had. And so it's a further destruction of the job base and quality of life in the true sense of the African American workforce. Is that something that, it was something that just kind of hit me. Is that something that you've seen as a reality of the loss of public sector jobs and so on?
Yeah, so we were talking about the working poor, lower income folks. Now let's step up the class ladder. So teachers, administrators, more middle class jobs. So the state, the moderate Democrat at the time, Kathleen Blanco, had been pushing prior to Katrina to take over some of the New Orleans public schools. Some of them were not doing well. Understood what the motivation was there. But, there's a duly elected school board. And so before the storm, there was an effort, and they took over 3 or 4 of the worst performing schools. But after the storm, within 2 months of Katrina, the state had taken over virtually every public school in New Orleans. St. Bernard Parish, it's a suburban parish just south and east of New Orleans. It was 100% flooded. They didn't lay off all their teachers. They put them on, emergency leave. They didn't have the money to pay them, full time. But as soon as they started rebuilding the schools, they were the first ones hired back. Orleans Parish, the New Orleans public school, they fired en masse every single teacher, every single employee, 7,000 or so people. And that's, by the way, on top of the 3,000 city workers who were laid off at around that time. So you had like 10,000 families, largely African American, dealing with a loss of job at the same time they're losing homes and they're displaced. And there was a lawsuit that the teachers filed saying, like, okay, but once you restarting the schools, we have tenure, we have rights of first refusal for a job. The lower courts ruled in favor of the teachers. The higher court, the appellate court, ruled in favor of the teachers, but there wasn't any money. It was like, oh, now you owe them $1.5 billion. Well, the public school system in New Orleans didn't have it, 1/3, 1/5 that kind of money. So, it's just this empty victory that they won. It's really, then there's kind of this period. So right after the storm, 100 out of the 120 or so schools were flooded. Every school was closed in those first months, but slowly schools are coming around. It was so chaotic. I wrote a story recently about the Katrina kids, those who were in school at the time of Katrina and saw at first the government didn't care. They're stuck in this flooded city. the federal government's not rescuing them, and then they're traumatized. They have to come back to these schools. They're changing constantly. So let's start at charter school. Well, this charter school opens, but it closes 2 years later. Now you have to go find another one. People talked about what they needed after Katrina was just a sense of stability. We liked the neighborhood school. It wasn't perfect, but we knew the teachers. We had a relationship there. The older brother went there. A student was there for a few years, and then Katrina hit, but they're gone. It's no longer a neighborhood system. You were right. It's a 90% plus charter system. You have all these stories of some kid, he's in elementary school, getting up at 6 a.m. in the dark, waiting at a bus stop, to transfer two transfers to get to school. It's really this chaotic system that in the last couple of years has finally stabilized. But you have special needs kids. There was a lawsuit, and the state, the public school system, had to admit they were failing the special needs kids, because what you saw the charter schools doing is cherry picking. We want certain kinds of students because we want to show that our scores are going up. New Orleans actually the leading suspension rate in the country, and I have to think it's because it was a charter system that wanted to show off how well it was doing and got rid of any kid. Any kid was expendable if they weren't helping with the numbers.
And, of course, there were the mass layoffs of the teachers and paraprofessionals in the school systems. And some people say that the African-American middle class has been shrinking and poverty is increasing, especially a situation which is really desperate for people, given the fact that living costs are so high.
Right. I mean, New Orleans is a much more expensive city today than it was prior to Katrina. Some of that is housing. Some of it is because the center of town is thriving. You have gentrified neighborhoods. A little bit feels like Brooklyn. There are a few neighbors. So prices, house prices, rents. There's a lot of good that comes with that. The art scene, the restaurant scene. There's a real vibrancy there. But at the same time, it just becomes a more expensive city in what we see. And this statistic is just tragic. So New Orleans has the second highest wealth gap of all American cities. In case you're curious, Atlanta is number one. It's on par. The wealth gap in New Orleans is on par with Zambia in Africa. And the most tragic part is it's getting wider. In the year 2000, the median income for a black family was $30,000 a year in New Orleans. In 2013, that was down to $25,000 for the median black family. Go to white families, it was in the high 40s prior to Katrina. Now it's around 60. They're seeing a growth in the white community, and in the black community is a move backwards. It's because of an inequity among the recovery. I like to say it was not an equal opportunity storm. If you owned a home in New Orleans, you were more than 3 times more likely to be flooded out by Katrina and the failure of the levees if you're a black homeowner than if you're a white homeowner. And there's racial geography. The whites got to the high ground first. By the time black home ownership was widely available, folks had no choice but to move in the lower-lying areas. So much of the city that flooded, that was heavily the black community. And I mentioned before that all the attention was on homeowners, not renters. Even there was an inequity. Let's move up the class ladder to middle class and professional class. They based this program called Road Home, $10 billion program, the largest housing recovery program in U.S. history. An amazing program, and from the federal government putting forward all this money. They decided to give the money out not based on the cost of rebuilding, not replacement cost to use the insurance term, but based on the assessed value of the home prior to Katrina. And, basically you go neighborhood by neighborhood and you see that the same 2,000 square foot home in a white community is worth twice as much money as one in the black community. So you've got a program that's giving you money based on the assessed value when, of course, all of us know that the price of a home in a black community is typically much lower than one in the white community. And so all these people were left short. A federal judge in 2010, 5 years after Katrina, declared Road Home a racially discriminatory policy. But by that point, of the $10 billion, there was like $150 million left, and it was too late. And so you go to black middle-class neighborhoods, and they're 60, 70% back 10 years after Katrina, and you compare it to Lakeview, a white prosperous community that was flooded after Katrina, it's 100% back. And the reason for that is policy. There was a policy put in place that harmed the black homeowners compared to the white homeowners, and so many black homeowners were left short because of this glitch, mistake, intentional. I'm not sure I could say why it happened, but it did happen, and it's just meant for an unequal recovery post-Katrina.
When I was reading your book, the images that again came to mind reminded me very much of the video, actually, of the death grip of Eric Garner by the police. Here you portray, and suddenly America saw on TV as though it had not existed and we were totally oblivious, the enormity of the poverty. The homes split in half by rushing water, the trapped families struggling to flag down help from the rooftops, people who could not leave, they had no resources to do that. People searching for loved ones were swept away by the torrent. This was a case of abject, corrosive poverty on the soul of America. But the response still seems to be, and it unnerves me enormously as the years have passed, people like the darling of the liberal community, Malcolm Gladwell, now, who says in the New Yorker that there should have been a smaller footprint. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. And he's talking, of course, about the thousands upon thousands who can't return, whether he realizes it or not. He's talking about the public housing that was needlessly destroyed, that was not damaged by the flood, which assured that poorer people, that people of African ancestry could not stay, would not be able to come back to these neighborhoods. That's so much of the picture and the lessons that I take from Katrina. Am I off base on that?
No, I mean, it's a couple of data points here. So at the time of Katrina, 1 in 4 New Orleanians did not own a car. And so on Sunday morning, right, 20 hours before Katrina hits, the mayor, Ray Nagin at the time, declares a mandatory evacuation. Well, you might as well have been saying you're required to take a week off in Aruba. I mean, a mandatory evacuation, but there was no buses, there were no trains, there was no plan to help the disabled, those without cars. And then there's people who had a car, but it was not exactly the most reliable car. And the average cost of evacuating, they estimated, was about $500. This was at the end of the month, August 29th. It was right before school started, or right at the start of school. New Orleans schools start early. And so, it caught people at a time when they didn't exactly have working people, middle-class people, did not have much discretionary income at that moment. So, this idea that you heard at the time, like, well, why didn't they get themselves out? They have the self to blame. It's like, well, how are they supposed to do that? I mean, some had an aunt or a friend, a neighbor who would take them out. But so many were trapped because they had no choice. Another point, the whole shrink the footprint debate was interesting. I was there for 8 months reporting on the storm and its aftermath in the New York Times, and that was my piece. I would go to all these meetings, and I got it. You had geographers saying, like, hey, listen, this community is 5-8 feet below sea level, and it's vulnerable to this kind of flooding. The flip side of that is something I mentioned before, that, well, the problem is, like, well, who was living in the low-lying neighborhoods and why? So if you went with the plan that the city had put forward, this panel that the mayor had put together, you would have been telling 80% of the black population of New Orleans, I'm sorry, we're not going to rebuild your neighborhoods, but maybe you could find someplace else to live. I mean, it was just this impossible thing to do. But on the other hand, there was never any plan. And so what you see are all these half-built neighborhoods. The 7th Ward, traditional black working-class neighborhood, bricklayers and clerks in City Hall, that kind of neighborhood. It's a wreck right now. I mean, it was this really stable neighborhood prior to Katrina. I mean, it had its issues, but it was a relatively stable neighborhood with home ownership. And now it's like 50-60% back, and you start to see newcomers to the city, largely white, moving in because, of course, they could get cheap housing there. It's not far from the center of town. Pontchartrain Park, a black middle-class neighborhood, historic neighborhood, a neighborhood that in the 1950s was the first subdivision in New Orleans, in the state of Louisiana, that allowed for black home ownership. It's a tragedy. It's maybe 2/3 back, 3/4 back, 10 years after Katrina. New Orleans East, a black professional class neighborhood with some very, very wealthy parts to it. There's a lot where the African American lawyers and judges and teachers, medical folks live. It's maybe 80% back 10 years after Katrina. And so we've been stressing kind of the impoverished aspect. I mean, that's what we all saw when we saw Katrina in the aftermath of Katrina. But it's affected the black middle class and the black professional class. There are 100,000 less African Americans living in New Orleans today than at the time of Katrina, and this was a city of 455,000 at the time. We're talking about a profound change in a city, and yet I just got back from New Orleans where they were having this celebration more than a commemoration of New Orleans, and you had the mayor, white mayor, doing his victory lap of like, wow, look at the New Orleans miracle that we're back. In fact, he declared the recovery behind us, and let's move on. And like, how are they hearing that in these half-built communities?
Gary, the thing that I really thought was just stirring, I have to recommend, because for anyone who cares about poverty, for people who think black life matters, for people who are interested in the role of government in the wealth divide in this country, you really need to read Gary's book, After the Flood. It is an anatomy, or really a picking apart of so many of the hypocrisies and problems, perhaps their most eloquent recitation that exists today. So you really, really need to get that. And I have to also tell people that Gary is going to be speaking. You have time to organize for this. It's on Tuesday, September 23rd at 12 noon at the 92nd Street Y. That's 12 noon, Tuesday, September 23rd, 92nd Street Y, which is 1395, I believe. Yeah, 1395 Lexington Avenue in New York. You should go and listen. Finally, in the time that we have left, and I'm really sorry, and I want you to come back just to look at some of the things that you've done so well, the evolution and distribution through the Road Home program, following people from the old line, money millionaires, to the middle-class black families in New Orleans East, to the white transplants, to the lower Ninth Ward natives. All of that is part of Gary's writing and books, and so important for people who care about social justice. How do you sum up? What have you learned? What do you want us to learn in the advent of Katrina on this, its 10th anniversary?
The intentionality. If a disaster happens, a city doesn't come back, I can understand that. If the government had done what they could, but, to cite Malcolm Gladwell's article, he has a long article in the New Yorker, some people found a better life in Houston. They went to better schools for the kids, maybe better health care, maybe they found a better job, whatever it was, and that's great. You found a better life, that's great. What I think is just so tragic about the post-Katrina New Orleans story is that there's so many people who were working hard to get back, and rather than government helping, they got in the way. Or even if government didn't do anything, they just got in the way. The policies they came up with were deliberately made to harm lower-income people to come back together. If you don't believe me, there were people saying it. You had white uptown elites, those who were running the business community, who used to run the city and were very unhappy that a 68% black city was being run by African-American leadership. They spoke openly about, this is our chance. This is our chance to change this city to, quote, one, demographically, 68% black city, and politically, a black-run city. And by the way, within 5 years, with so many fewer African Americans there, you had the city's first white mayor in 32 years, a white supermajority on the city council, a white prosecutor replaced a black prosecutor, white police chief, whites were running the public housing and the school system. I mean, I quote a Tulane professor who called it the political defeat of Black New Orleans, and I have to think that was right. And again, it was deliberate. It was a deliberate attempt. It wasn't just like, well, okay, people found a better life, so that's all for the best.
Well, they were all betrayed by a political system that was supposed to be accountable to them as citizens, and the abandonment was only the beginning. Once the water receded, the dehumanization, the dehumanizing political events to follow would solidify the sentiment in many ways that no one cared. But we must make it so. Black Life Matters. Gary Rivlin, thank you so much for your extraordinary, important writing. There are so many lessons. I think we should send a free copy to all of the candidates for the presidency. They need a little education. And certainly all of us, let's get it. After the Flood, Gary Rivlin, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now we move quickly to still ask, which side are you on? Over 1,000 people a year are killed by police, yet since 2005, there have been less than 60 indictments and fewer than 25 convictions. Those stats come from the Washington Post of April 12, 2015. Building for Rise Up October to Stop Police Terror, which will be a series of mass protests to be held in New York, October 22nd to October 24th, the Committee to Stop Mass Incarceration filled the historic First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem, where family members of those whose lives were stolen by police violence spoke, their bodies often shaking and their faces forever etched in pain. The families pleas for justice for their loved ones and to bring an end to racist policing policies and practices and to dismantle the system of mass incarceration were amplified by voices of conscience and activist leaders.
By the end of the evening, when asked which side are you on, the audience rose as one in their resolve to build a massive mobilization to stop police terror and murder. And to help mobilize for Rise Up October, we now bring you some of the highlights preparing for October 22nd to 24th, when we can, as a mighty force, demonstrate which side we are on.
We begin with Marsha Coleman Adebayo, a member of Black Agenda Report and fresh from a Black Lives Matter demonstration in her home city of Washington, D.C., where the mayor had just announced bringing in more cops to police the community and government's intention to at will search the homes of anyone previously incarcerated. Wow. Let's listen.
Power to the people. This is a wonderful spiritual moment for all of us to recommit to our fight for justice. And I'd like to tell you why I am supporting Rise Up October. You see, I am the mother of a son who has been stopped by police over 30 times. That means my son's life has been threatened over 30 times. He has been terrorized by the police in the Washington, D.C. area. He has suffered severe depression and anxiety. You see, I am every Black mother because I don't know a Black mother whose son has not been terrorized by police. I don't even think we have the right to call ourselves mothers if we don't stand up and protect our children. I don't think we have the right to call ourselves fathers unless we stand up and protect our children. So we have recently organized a mothers organization, Mothers Against Police Violence, because not only are our children in Washington, D.C. being murdered and harassed, they're also being sexually abused in Washington, D.C. So we, as parents, need to stand up and say, you're either going to take us out or you're going to stop harassing our children. But you've got to take a choice because it cannot be both. The mayor of Washington, D.C. 2 days ago announced that under a new program, it's really a pretext because of a rising crime rate in Washington, D.C., she's going to hire 500 more police. Now you have to understand, she didn't say she was going to create 500 new jobs. No, what she's doing is she's putting in place a structure to kill and to incarcerate and to terrorize our children. And so in the streets of Washington, yesterday and today, we have been in the streets protesting this program. Let me get worse. The program will allow police to search the homes of ex-offenders. And in Washington, D.C., 1 out of every 5 black guys are ex-offenders, which means that all black men in Washington, D.C. essentially will be covered under this law. So once you are labeled an offender, you are always an offender. There is never an X before your name. So this program will amount to the reactivation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But instead, it will be the Fugitive Slave Act of 2015. So brothers and sisters, if this goes down in D.C., next will be New York, and then Detroit. You got it.
On the poster, there is a photo there, if you can find it, of a young girl named Ayanna Stanley Jones. Ayanna was 7 years old when her life was stolen by cops in Detroit, Michigan, when they raided her grandmother's home, all while filming a documentary series. This was back in May of 2010. The officer who killed Ayanna was never convicted of a crime, and her grandmother, Miss Myrtilla Jones, has been speaking out on this injustice from the moment Ayanna died in her arms. She joined the Rise Up October tour in Cleveland, Chicago, and Ferguson, Missouri. Please welcome me in introducing Miss Myrtilla Jones.
Hello. My 7-year-old granddaughter, Ayanna Stanley Jones, was murdered May 16, 2010 by Detroit police SWAT team member Joseph Weekly.
Let me tell you the problem. I went to Detroit when Ayanna Jones was murdered. This is the grandma that was laying on the couch with Ayanna. They were asleep when the cops came there supposed to be looking for some young man. They threw a grenade through the window. In the midst of them throwing the grenade through the window, they shot, the police officer shot his gun. Now you imagine you sleeping on the couch with your grandbaby and you're so helpless. The cop literally shot little 7-year-old Ayanna Jones. Then he turned around and arrested this woman. And they had her in jail for 8 hours, questioning her, trying to say that she made the cop shoot Ayanna. They just took this case to trial. The judge went after the grandmother, told the grandmother she better not get up on that stand and show no emotion. She better not show nothing, no feelings, no nothing. How dare you? This woman cannot close her eyes without seeing and what that officer did to Ayanna. You see the state she's in? This is the first time I've been up on stage with this grandmother, but I've been talking to her and following with her. And this is why we need people to try to say, which side are you on? How much more do we have to do?
I'm riding. Because I want to see what side people are on. I am 7 years old, sleeping. I've never seen nothing like that in my life, and I hope to never see it again. And I shouldn't have had to see it, and my 7-year-old sleeping doing it. I've traveled all the way from Detroit, Michigan, to ask everybody, which side are you on? It's been 5 years since Ayanna was murdered. Ayanna gets no justice, no peace in Detroit, Michigan. Nobody acknowledges my granddaughter. They came back a year later and arrested my son, her dad. Stop the mass incarceration as well. I need him out here to raise his 6 surviving sons. Ayanna was his only girl. Joseph Weekly, he has 2 daughters. He's going to get the chance to see his daughters go to prom, walking down the aisle. My son will never get that chance because Ayanna was his only daughter. So I'm asking everybody to take a side and stop mass incarceration, police brutality, because it's not only the killings, it's the beatings, it's the tasings. I mean, it's not only here in New York. Detroit, they don't do nothing. They don't even recognize my grandbaby. She get more love from all of y'all than anywhere else. She get more love from other cities and states, even other countries, than she gets in Detroit, Michigan, where she was born, where she was raised, where she was murdered by a man named Joseph the Brain Weekly, a police officer that's supposed to protect and serve her. Then they came around a year later, like I said, and took her daddy, my son, Charles Jones, and locked him up to where he can't raise his 6 sons. I got to help do it. I raised my children. I got 8 kids, well, babies. 2 women, 6 men. I raised my children. I should not have to raise my grandchildren. All right, love y'all too.
Our next speaker is also a grandmother. She's traveled all the way from Madison, Wisconsin to be with us today to tell us of her experience. Her grandson, Tony Robinson's life, was stolen less than 6 months ago. He was only 18, unarmed, and in his own home. The police officer who pushed his way into the apartment where Tony was not indicted. We have his grandmother Sharon and his Aunt Lori here with us today to speak to us and tell us their story.
This is my grandson. He was 19. He's young. He is black. And he is beautiful. And I am here to tell you that they took his life with 7 bullets. He shot him 3 times, dropped his flashlight, picked it up, shot him 3 more times, looked at him, and shot him again. My boy was unarmed, and nothing he did was deserved for that. And we suffer. I'm looking at all these people, and we're the human side of this. We suffer. I cry every day. I have to go through hundreds of pages of evidence because they didn't indict him. They said, no, he didn't do anything wrong. And I say to you, if you lie to justify your actions, are they justifiable? No. And he lied. And the Madison police lied. And the DA lied. And they disgraced my family. They made us not the victims, but the criminal. They made my grandson a criminal that he's not. And I'm telling you, I'm tired. And I'm not standing for this anymore. We are one people. We are the human race, but they are targeting black folks. I'm sorry. I get really emotional. They are wrong. I feel this every day. My daughter feels this every day. All my grandchildren feel this day. And yes, I am from a rich and multicultural family. But like she said, what did she say? I am unapologetically black. That's right. This is my mother. The reason why Rise of October is so important is because there ain't enough room in this church for all of the names. The reason why Rise of October is so important because in Madison, Wisconsin, we are the #1 worst place for minorities to live and the #3 happiest place in the country. We are the #1 city in the entire country for minority youth incarceration. That means 18 and under. Our population of jail consists of 3/4 black children. Meanwhile, our population outside consists of 8% black people. The truths that they are providing to you are not truths at all. The reason why Rise of October is so important is because I neglected the facts, and because of it, my nephew has paid. Because it could be any one of you. And if it makes you uncomfortable, I'm glad. It should. The blood of all of these people stains your hand the same way it does mine. My nephew, yes, he is biracial. That means you, it could be your nephew. Or you, it could be your grandchild. This is no longer polarized. We have, as a people, been taught to stay divided because they can control us easier. Hey, if we stood up, there's 7 billion of us. If we stood up, what could anybody do? It is time to wake up. It is time to see we are not different. We are a people with different cultures and different ways to live, but we are human. And it is time. All power to the people.
Our next family member to speak is the mother of a young man, Justice Howell, who was killed while he was running away from the police. The coroner who performed his autopsy ruled his death a homicide. The prosecutors in Zion, Illinois, did not do right by their community. They said that it was justifiable, and the officer was charged for nothing. Please welcome me in introducing Justice Howell's mother, LaToya.
Every time I come up before all of y'all, I don't know what to say, but the words start to flow through me. Every time I look at a young face, I see my son and think about his demise. Every time I see little boys, I shed a tear because I know that one day they can grow up and be killed, taken from you. That means all of your teaching, everything you told him not to do, everything he knew not to do, everything he was going to be, was stolen from him. And it's all to unqualified, racist, coward police. It ain't right. It's not enough to just tell somebody, oh, did you hear about so-and-so? They got killed by the police. I'm gonna need y'all to start saying, but guess what's next? We're gonna rise up. your granddaughter, your daughter, and you can walk around feeling like something was snatched from you. Y'all know what? When I heard it, y'all know, have y'all ever felt scared and just knew something's wrong? Then y'all took that breath and said, whoo, I'm glad that wasn't mine. I never got that chance to breathe. I never had that help. That was my boy laying dead in the street. They didn't even let me go back to see him. They wouldn't let me in the hospital. They told me repeatedly that he wasn't at the hospital, that wasn't my son. But it damn sure was, y'all. And that can be yours. You can be here just like me if you don't stand up. Tell the next person that y'all don't want no warning. The camera has to stop. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. And I know you heard it before. If looks could kill, you will be a Uzi. If looks could kill, you will be the bomb. Guess what, y'all? Looks are killing our kids. The way they look can get them killed. So I ask y'all today, which side are you on? Will you stand by the way and watch another kid get gunned down, beaten, another woman get raped? Would you stand by and just act like it ain't happening? I ask you today to stand up and choose your side. Power to the people. There's power in numbers. Power to the people, y'all. Thank you.
We have one more family member who wants to share. We have one more family member who wants to share. I'm going to call her over now.
I would like to share my story. I've been following with Juanita Young, Carl West. I've been coming out on all the events and trying to get the help that I need for my son. My son's name is Corey Nickens. He was killed here, right here in Manhattan, March 13, 2007. He was murdered while he was sitting in a restaurant eating. He was shot 12 times, but they try to say he had a gun, and that's the reason why they shot him. But turned out my son, all shots dead, the family done. It turned out he didn't have a gun, and the person that murdered my son, his name is Robert Tahaja. Robert Tahaja is the same officer that was involved in shooting the officer in Manhattan. His name was Omar Edwards. I'm still on the fight for justice for my son, and I'm not going to give up the struggle or the fight. And I would like everyone here to understand that I'm going to be out here fighting for the justice for all, and my son also. Please don't give up the fight. And, everybody, I really don't know what to say much, but I'm still out here for the fight for justice for my son. I haven't got anything. But the story with my son is so long, I really couldn't go into it all, but it's a lot of stuff behind everything with my son, but I'm still out here for the fight for my son. Thank you.
What he didn't tell you was the cop who murdered her son. His father was the owner of a restaurant here in Harlem. The cop shot himself in the ankle. He blames her son. They never took the bullet out the cop's ankle to show that he shot himself. No lawyer in New York will touch her case. We have tried through the years to get a lawyer to pick up her case. The way they got that case did, we can't get a lawyer to touch her case. But I come back up here to stand and ask you, they got a call out for people to help bring other families here for the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. If it's any way possible, you can help bring some more families to New York for October 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. Please do. I'm coming to you as a mother, as a family member. And we as families up here ask you to stand with us and those of us who want to be with us.
Join me in saluting these amazing, strong, and loving family members here. Thank you all. Dr. Cornel West is perhaps the leading public intellectual of his generation. He is professor of philosophy at Union Theological Seminary. Right. And he stands with the people. Dr. Cornel West.
Oh, yes, I'm blessed to have this brother as my head teaching assistant in my course on W.B. Du Bois. You all know W.B. Du Bois, the greatest public intellectual in the history of the American Empire. Give it up for the boys, because his spirit is here. Just like Cornel West, just like Adam B. Wells, just like Marcus Garvey. And we don't have a language to describe the fire of Malcolm X. Martin Luther King Jr. This is not a time for words when action is necessary. Because we come from a people, come from a tradition, a community, constitutes what the Isley brothers call a caravan of love. When you've been terrorized for 400 years, when you've been stigmatized for 400 years, but you still produce a John Coltrane who talks about love supreme. You still produce a Marvin Gaye who says, what's going on? Who cares for the children? Who really cares when you produce a Nina Simone that can talk about what it means to be young, gifted, and blessed when you produce a Donny Hathaway who can raise the question of someday we'll be free in the midst of so much terror, in the midst of so much trauma, in the midst of so much stigma. What it means to take a stand. Y'all remember Sly Stone? You know the song called Stand. You've been sitting much too long. There's a permanent crease in your right and wrong. Stand, there's a midget standing tall and the giant beside him about to fall. The American empire is in decline, y'all. Capitalist civilization, market-driven, obsessed with narrow individualism, hedonism, narcissism, suffering from a spiritual malnutrition and a moral constipation. Of the children, how can we live in a society in which almost 45% of all of our precious children of color live in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world? 22% of all of the children in America live in poverty. I don't care what color, each one equally precious. Something is wrong. That's a T-Sweat moment. Something just ain't right. And I come from a people, when I say people, I'm not talking about folk in the abstract. I'm talking about Cliff and Irene, my parents, that taught me to be a person of integrity and honesty and decency and have the courage to straighten my back up and tell the truth and to allow suffering to speak, but always put love at the center of it. Because there's no way that all this suffering could be going on, all of this political murder and terror could be going on. The school system produces soul murder every day. Gentrification of chocolate spaces with power grabs and land grabs. 1% of the population got 42% of the wealth and growing. Wages are stagnating for 40 years. Where's the outrage? If you really love folks, you hate the fact that they're being treated unjustly. And in the last 35 years during the Ice Age, the neoliberal Ice Age, and by neoliberal, all I mean is financialized, privatized, militarized. You got a problem? Financialize. Bring in the big money in the banks. Privatize. Push out the public life. Push out public education. Push out the public conversation on corporate media. Just be concerned about the money. Money, money. Wu-Tang Clan say what? Cream. Cash rules everything around me, but it doesn't have to rule me. I can decide which side I'm going to be on. I can decide who I'm going to be in solidarity with. Doesn't make any difference. All of us got equal status in the eyes of the God that I serve. Same status, same significance, But the problem is we live in the age of the sellout. Sellout preachers, sellout lawyers, sellout pharmacists, sellout professors, sellout civil rights leaders, across the board. Everybody's for sale. All you got to do is offer some money, little power, little status, and next thing you know, they change their tune. No, love doesn't allow you to do that. But black people at our best hated people but taught the world so much about love. Treated unjustly but taught the world so much about justice. Traumatized but taught the world so much about how to be cool. Black people at our best have been truth tellers, which means we've been crossbears before we were flag wavers. And that's part of our challenge in the age of Obama. But once we got a black president, we got too many folks waving the flag and not enough folks wanting to bear the cross. So many folks concerned with the breakthrough at the top and losing sight of those stuck in the basement. Those still catching hell, those wrecking of the earth, as the great Fanon talked about in the midst of the American Empire. Because black people, we moved from what, 244 years of not just slavery, but labor as a form of torture. It's against the law for black people to read or write. It's against the law for black people to worship God without white supervision. You see, that's more than the police state. What do? Stole away at night with ring shouts and held hands and lifted our voices just like the national anthem called Lift Every Voice. And in lifting your voice, we decided not to be an echo, not to be a copy, but an original. Not to be an imitation, but to be creation and innovation, providing something new for the world. That's the tradition that we're talking about in Stop Mass Incarceration. But for black people, anytime we decide to straighten our backs up, to tell the truth, to bear witness, and be willing to live and die for something bigger than you. Anytime we decide to do that, the powers that be start shaking. And when you don't love yourself, you don't love the people who look like you. You disrespect yourself, you disrespect folks who look like you. But lo and behold, when black people decide quit wearing the mask, be true to who God called you to be. It usually takes about every 30 years because when the black folk who do that, they either get murdered, they get shot down, they get lied on, they get scorned, they get rebuked, and the warriors are incarcerated. And what's left is just the milquetoast professionals who want to be successful. And I don't come from a tradition of a people. So much blood, sweat, and tears just to produce successful Negroes. I want to know what you're going to be faithful to. How you going to use your success? What kind of human being are you going to be given the material toys that you have? What you going to say at your funeral beyond the fact that you just had big mansions and a trophy spouse? Why? Because those who already died, we're going to allow their afterlife to work through us. Because we're going to have Sankofa, which means we're not going to move forward until we first look back and remember the best of those who came before that constitutes wind at our back. That's what Stop Mass Incarceration is about. That's why I call it the love train. Get on the love train. Curtis Mayfield said you don't need no ticket, just get on board. Get on board. Stop Mass Incarceration and decide which side you're really on and come with us. Not just October 24th, but decide to be a long distance runner like Mumi Abu-Jamal and so many others all the way through. Stay strong.
Have a good evening. I'm Mimi Rosenberg.
And Ken Nash, and we have a Labor Day special coming up 6 to 10 p.m. next week.
on Labor Day, of course.